first unit of English 391S, Doing Digital, involved having students investigate and to think about what counts as language in order to think through and to provide critical perspectives on learning Python, which is itself a coding language. So the first week, this course met once a week. The first week was primarily used to set up the humanistic framework for the course. So in this class, the course was framed as a course in the English department, and it was it counts for English credit, and it counts also for a credit in a new media program through UMass. The first day, the instructor chose to frame this course as primarily about humanistic questions. So learning Python was in service of investigating questions that have been part of humanistic inquiry since at least things were written down. This is a screenshot of the Moodle page for English 391S Doing Digital in fall 2017. So your course will of course look differently, but this is the way the instructor chose to design this course specifically on the status of language. So beginning in week 1, the students were asked to read Cratylus and Rousseau and to think about whether or not computer coding should count as a foreign language credit in high schools. The next week, we moved on to Saussure, and this essay is specifically on the arbitrariness of the sign. So the idea that there is no necessary connection between the word and the thing it designates. There is no connection between tree and the thing tree. It's just a sound that we've made that designates that concept. And as students read that essay, they moved into into working on a tutorial from Code Academy. So in Python, you can assign variables to whatever values. The only necessary connection is that you have assigned that variable. In Python, the word tree can designate hat, right? There is no necessary connection. So the same kind of arbitrariness from two different perspectives really helps students to understand coding as a whole, which can be a difficult thing to wrap one's head around. One thing that we quickly discovered was that you have to move very slowly if you're introducing a hardcore kind of coding skill to primarily humanist students. So most students had no experience with Python, and the original assignment was chapters 1 through 3. This became chapter 1. So drastically reducing homework, spending a lot more time in class demonstrating what they were being asked to do. So you will probably also find that you need to slow down dramatically. And part of the virtue of slowing down with introducing coding is that you'll be able to tell students and hopefully convince them early on that each tutorial requires a substantial time investment. So the impulse that students had was to just complete the tutorial, to move through it as quickly as possible, to check it off the list. But that meant they weren't really retaining any of the material. So if you can, try to frame this as slow and careful movement through a pretty small amount of material. Week 3, you can see that coding tutorials are reduced to 1 chapter. They are then reading Nietzsche on truth and lies in an extra-moral sense to think about truth and falsehood in language. So this is again pushing the idea of the arbitrariness of the category of truth and lie, and that with a Boolean language like Python, and as with most computer languages, things are either true or they are false. And that can be a difficult transition for students. So pairing it with a reading that they're quite well prepared to tackle. These were junior and senior English majors, and so they're fine with reading Nietzsche and thinking through difficult material. And that helped them approach some of the more challenging mental shifts required by coding languages. Week 4, moving into another Python tutorial, and then thinking about interactive fiction. So the first assignment asked students to design their own interactive fiction game in Python. And they were asked to play through 2 examples. And the great thing about these examples is that they depend on invented languages. In order to beat the game or to succeed at the game, you have to figure out a language that is being presented to you without any information to give background. So in Sauve Nux, if this will link for me, is a great game that asks you to effectively break out of your Master Magician's vault. And this is exactly what students were being asked to do in the same language as they were being asked to do it. What do I want to light? Let's try Lightroom. Okay, so it's not quite as dark as I thought. Sliver provides a tiny amount of light. That's not going to get you anywhere. What if I try to walk? Walk north. Okay, well, thanks. So anyways, this is an example of the kinds of games that students ended up making, which they had a lot of fun with. This was a very successful project because students had started to really gain confidence in Python by the time they were asked to write their own game. But it really did take 4 weeks. Honestly, it was week 4, and there was a huge shift in morale in the classroom. In week 5, the week was preparation for the project, and this worked quite well. In this course, the class session before the final project was due, students were just given the day to prepare, and there were 2 instructors in the room, and they were able to help troubleshoot. So if you can do that, provide 1 class meeting for just working on the project, almost like a study hall, and if you can also have 2 or more assistants, or 2 or more instructors in the classroom, that is an immense help. That is a big pull on resources, obviously, but the more people you can have that can help troubleshoot, that will help ease some of the technological challenges. Unit 2, reading machines. So if the first unit asks students to think about what is language and to participate in creating a world based on a computer language, the second unit asked them to think about, well, if Python is a language, can computers read? And can computers read human language? And then also, what do we mean by reading? Week 6 was a guest lecture discussing machine reading and thinking about creative uses for machine reading, which transitioned into the next unit on can computers read? Week 7 asked them to read an essay from Proust on reading, and then to begin a different kind of humanities or Python for Humanities tutorial. I would recommend this particular tutorial, a Python course for the humanities, by two professors, and this program is intended to get students to ultimately write their own code that lets them analyze a corpus of books. So it goes through a few of the basics in Python, not very thoroughly, so it's good to maybe supplement it with a kind of introductory tutorial like the one from Code Academy. But because this tutorial is more targeted to the goals of humanists, it is a bit more it gives a bit more guidance as to why students would be doing the things that they're doing. The other tutorial from Code Academy is very much kind of learning the basics of Python's variable assignment or defining what a function is, etc. And it's really useful for the basics, but it might be good to move more quickly into the targeted goals that you're asking of the students kind of for the course as a whole. Week 8, Reading Fish, Is There a Text in This Class? Which is again about the definition of a text. So if the first unit is on what counts as language, this unit focuses on what is a text. Week 9 and 10 were much more technically invested because here students really hit a low point in morale where they had gotten some pretty good proficiency in Unit 1 with creating interactive fictions. And so about week 4 was a really high point. And then switching subjects and switching into a more complex humanistic task was quite challenging. So in this week, we found ourselves shifting to a lot more technological diagnosis and workshopping. Even as we were really pushing humanist questions, weeks 9 and 10 were a difficult set of weeks because the goal was to learn Python and then to use it for humanist goals. What ended up happening was that students learned Python and then they didn't understand what they were being asked to do with it. So even as the tech became an issue, even more of an issue was the framing of the tech. So I encourage you to really think about how you're going to explain to your students, why are they using Python to think about texts, right? Try to have an answer for yourself about the broader goals of the specific technological skills that you are asking your students to master. Weeks 12 through 14 were the shortest unit on discourse and the least technical. So because there had been so much struggle with the technology throughout the semester, in this last section, the instructor did a lot of the heavy lifting on the back end. So a program from the docnow.io interface in order to archive Twitter data, and specifically did that on net neutrality, Blue Lives Matter, Me Too, and Black Lives Matter, and asked students to run those searches through Gephi, which is a network analysis program, and in Gephi to simply use that tool to analyze the existing networks that the instructor had found. So it was much more a traditional humanist task, basically giving students a set of textual data and asking them to draw implications from that data. One thing you might want to think about is to do something like this small unit earlier on. So because the instructor could provide the Twitter data to students and then ask them to do a pretty clearly humanist analysis of the discourse networks that were forming around Twitter data, that might be a good transition into some of the more heavy-duty Python subjects. So this was originally supposed to be the most tech-heavy unit of the course as students gained proficiency in Python. It ended up being the least tech-heavy unit, partly because the original design asked students to move through the Python a little bit too quickly. The last weeks of the course were difficult. The first half of the course was heavy-duty learning how to code in Python. And then the second half, they were asked to pretty quickly switch to analyzing the results of Python. And that transition was difficult and was presented without perhaps as much framing as could have been helpful. As you build your course, I encourage you to really think about how you're framing each week and each section of material. The more explicit and transparent you can be about what you're asking students to do, the better. It's pretty frustrating to learn to code if you're an English major who's never been asked to do that before. It seems totally outside your skill set. The thing that helps is to explain how the logic of the transitions is working for you as a teacher. So if you can use yourself and your own learning process as an example, that can often be really helpful to students so that they know that they're not stupid if they're struggling with Python. It's just that it's hard. So if you can try to kind of create a learning community, that is going to ease some of the frustrations that will probably inevitably occur. All right, thanks for watching, and if you have any questions, please explore the other materials we've provided on this site, and hopefully we can give you some inspiration for your own Doing Digital style course.